November 18th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. At 04:27 hours, before the first thread of dawn could pierce the canopy of shattered pines, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Frost clung to the splintered bark like death's own fingerprints. The temperature had dropped to -4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that each exhaled breath materialized as vapor before dissolving into the perpetual twilight beneath those ancient trees. Somewhere in the darkness, a German MG-42 machine gun waited, its barrel still warm from the previous night's slaughter. The weapon had claimed 17 American lives in the past 72 hours. Its crew of 4 Heer infantrymen, average age 22, had not slept in 4 days. They had learned to recognize the sound of American boots on frozen leaves. They had learned to distinguish between the crack of an M1 Garand and the sharper report of a Mauser. They had learned that in this forest, mercy was a luxury no man could afford. What they had not learned was what they were about to witness. The Hürtgen Forest, extending across 50 square miles of densely wooded terrain along the German-Belgian border, had, by November 1944, become what veterans would later call the most savage killing ground of the entire European campaign. The Americans called it the Death Factory. The Germans called it the Green Hell. Between September 19th and December 16th, 1944, the United States First Army would commit 7 full divisions to this meat grinder, suffering over 33,000 casualties in exchange for meager advances measured not in miles, but in meters. For every 100 yards gained, the forest consumed approximately 300 American lives. The mathematics of attrition had reached a horrifying equilibrium. The rate of casualties exceeded the rate at which reinforcements could be processed through replacement depots. Entire rifle companies entered the forest at full strength and emerged, if they emerged at all, with fewer men than a single platoon. Combat medics bore a disproportionate burden of this carnage. The medical department's field forces would record 13,174 casualties during the entire war in Europe, of which 2,274 were killed in action. In the Hürtgen Forest specifically, the casualty rate among medical personnel approached 40% in some units, nearly double the infantry average. The reasons were grimly straightforward. While the Geneva Convention theoretically protected medics who wore the distinctive Red Cross brassard and carried no weapons, the chaos of forest combat rendered such protections meaningless. Artillery did not discriminate. Tree bursts, shells that detonated upon striking the overhead canopy, showering defenders with metal fragments and wooden shrapnel, killed medics and riflemen with equal efficiency. The Germans, for their part, generally respected the Red Cross when they could see it. But in the Hürtgen's perpetual gloom, visibility rarely extended beyond 30 meters. The American medic in this story belonged to the 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, a unit that would suffer 4,053 battle casualties and more than 2,000 non-battle casualties during 1 month of fighting in the forest. His name, according to incomplete records preserved in the National Archives, was likely Private First Class, though his exact identity has been obscured by the chaos of wartime record-keeping and the subsequent decades of historical fog. What we know with certainty comes from the fragmentary testimony of German prisoners interviewed after the war, and from the official after-action reports filed by American medical officers in December 1944. What we know is this. On the morning of November 18th, in the sector designated on military maps as Coordinate Grid Square 7345, approximately 400 German soldiers of the 275th Infantry Division occupied a defensive position that the Americans needed to capture. And caught between these two opposing forces, in a stretch of cratered earth that both sides had designated a killing zone, lay 27 wounded American soldiers. They had been there for 6 hours. Some cried out, some had lapsed into the silence that precedes death. All of them were beyond reach. Because the moment anyone moved into that open ground, the German machine guns opened fire. This was the tactical reality that the American commander faced at 04:30 hours on November 18th. He had three options, none of them acceptable. He could order an assault to recover the wounded, which would result in additional casualties his already depleted company could not sustain. He could call in artillery on the German position, which would almost certainly kill the wounded Americans caught in between. Or he could wait and listen to his men die slowly in the frost. At 4:45, 5 hours, the medic made the decision for him. The German machine gunners saw him first as a shadow moving against shadows, a vertical form where everything else was horizontal devastation. Feldwebel Klaus Hermann, the NCO commanding the MG-42 position, would later tell American interrogators that his initial thought was that the figure was a hallucination born of exhaustion. Nothing living moved in that open ground. Nothing could. They had proven this repeatedly over the previous 3 days. Yet, here was this vertical shadow, and as the thin light of dawn finally began to penetrate the forest canopy, Hermann saw the impossible. A single American soldier walking directly toward the German line. Not running, walking. The Red Cross brassard on the medic's left arm became visible at approximately 40 meters. It glowed white against the olive drab of his uniform like a beacon, like a challenge, like a prayer made visible. In his right hand, he carried a medical bag, standard issue, canvas stained with blood that had frozen into dark continents on the fabric surface. In his left hand, he carried nothing. No weapon, no rifle, no grenade. He had left his helmet behind, and his dark hair moved slightly in the pre-dawn wind that sliced through the forest. Hermann's finger rested on the trigger of the MG-42, though weapon was capable of firing 200 rounds per minute. At 40 meters, it would have reduced the medic to pulp before he could complete another 3 steps. Every man in the German position understood this equation. The medic himself certainly understood it. He was walking toward 400 rifles and a dozen machine guns with nothing but a canvas bag and a symbol that had protected. Men only when all parties agreed that symbols still meant something. In the Hürtgen Forest in November 1944, very few things still meant anything. But Hermann did not fire. He would later struggle to articulate why. In the interrogation transcript preserved at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, he said, "Es war etwas an der Art, wie ging." There was something about the way he walked. Not like he expected to live, like he had already accepted he would die, but he was going to do this thing first. You do not shoot a man like that. Even here, you do not shoot a man like that. The medic reached the first wounded American at 04:47 hours. The soldier, a 19-year-old private from Ohio, had taken shrapnel in both legs and the lower abdomen. He had been lying in the frozen mud for 7 hours. By all physiological metrics, he should have already been dead from hypothermia and blood loss. The medic knelt beside him, and from the German position, 45 meters away, the defenders watched as the American removed his own jacket and draped it over the wounded man. Then the medic's hands began to move with the practiced efficiency of countless repetitions. Checking pulse, examining wounds, preparing the morphine syringe. The morphine syringe was perhaps the most recognizable symbol of American medical care in World War II. A small tube of sterile narcotic with an attached needle. It could be administered quickly even by wounded men themselves. American medics carried them by the dozen, attached to their uniform like small talismans against suffering. The German military had morphine, but not in such abundance, not distributed with such casual generosity. To the German soldiers watching from their foxholes, the sight of the American medic systematically injecting morphine into the wounded man represented something they had learned to associate with American forces generally: abundance. A nation wealthy enough, organized enough, to mass-produce mercy itself and distribute it even to dying men in a frozen forest. The medic stabilized the Ohio private, then moved to the next wounded man. Then the next. The sun had risen fully by now, though beneath the forest canopy it remained a perpetual dusk. The temperature had climbed to -2 degrees Celsius. In the American lines, 70 meters behind the medic, more than 100 soldiers watched through rifle sights and could not believe what they were seeing. In the German lines, 400 men watched and could not decide what they were supposed to do. The medic treated 11 men in the first hour. He did not hurry, but he did not waste motion. Each soldier received the same methodical care: assessment, morphine, bandaging, stabilization. The German defenders noticed that the medic spoke to each wounded man, though they could not hear the words. They noticed that sometimes the wounded soldiers reached up to grasp the medic's arm, and that the medic did not pull away. They noticed that twice the medic paused his work to close the eyes of soldiers who had died while he moved between positions, and that even these dead men received a moment of the medic's attention. A hand placed briefly on the forehead, a gesture that looked like benediction. At 06:15 hours, a German officer made a decision that would be recorded in his unit's war diary and later analyzed by military historians as an example of spontaneous battlefield restraint. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, commanding the 2nd Company of the 275th Infantry Division's 3rd Battalion, issued an order to his section. No one was to fire unless the American forces initiated an attack. The medic was to be allowed to continue his work. When asked why he gave this order, Weber would later say, "We had been killing each other for so long. Here was something different. Here was someone trying to undo what we had all been doing. I could not give the order to stop him." The medic treated 18 men before the shooting started again, but it was not the Germans who broke the ceasefire. At 06:45 hours, an American artillery observer, positioned 300 meters to the rear and unaware of the medic's presence in the no-man's land, called in a fire mission on the German position. The first shells struck at 06:47, 105mm rounds that detonated in the trees and sent shrapnel screaming through the air. The medic threw himself over the soldier he was treating, using his own body as a shield. When the barrage lifted 90 seconds later, the medic stood, checked that the soldier beneath him was still alive, and continued his work. The German defenders, who had scrambled for cover during the American barrage, returned to their positions to find the medic still moving among the wounded, still kneeling, still treating. One of his hands was bleeding where shrapnel had opened the skin across his knuckles, but he had not stopped to bandage it. Hermann, the machine gun NCO, would later tell interrogators, "That was when I understood we were watching something we would tell our children about, if we lived long enough to have children. This was something that would outlive all of us." By 07:30 hours, the medic had treated 23 men. 4 had died despite his efforts, and he had arranged their bodies with their hands folded across their chests, their faces toward the sky. The remaining 19 were stable enough to survive if they could be evacuated. The medic had used every morphine syringe he carried. He had exhausted his supply of sulfa powder, the antiseptic that American medics sprinkled into wounds to prevent infection. He had torn his own uniform shirt into strips to create additional bandages. And he had not yet attempted to move any of the wounded men back to American lines. At 07:40 hours, he began the evacuations. One by one, the medic dragged the wounded soldiers toward the American position. Some could assist by pushing with their uninjured legs. Others were completely immobile, dead weight that had to be hauled meter by meter across the cratered ground. The medic did not stop between trips. As soon as he delivered one wounded man to the American aid station, he turned and walked back into no man's land to retrieve another. The German defenders watched each transit. At any moment, they could have ended this. A single bullet. A short burst from the MG-42. But the order not to fire held, and 400 German soldiers who had killed without hesitation for days and weeks and months did not pull their triggers. The 19th and final evacuation occurred at 9:23 hours. The soldier, a corporal from Pennsylvania who had taken a bullet through his left lung, was the most critically wounded of all the survivors. The medic carried him in a fireman's hold across both shoulders, staggering under the weight, falling twice, rising both times, continuing forward. When he finally crossed into American lines and laid the corporal on a stretcher, the medic's own uniform was soaked with blood, some his, most belonging to the men he had treated. He had been working in no man's land for 4 hours and 38 minutes. He had treated 23 men, saved 19 lives, and had not carried a weapon the entire time. At 09:30 hours, as medical personnel evacuated the wounded to the battalion aid station, the medic turned and faced the German position. The range was 70 meters. Through the thin morning light, Feldwebel Hermann could see the American's face clearly for the first time. The medic was young, perhaps 23, with exhaustion carved into his features like erosion on stone. For a long moment, the medic simply stood there, looking toward the German line. Then he raised his right hand, the one with shrapnel cuts across the knuckles, and held it up in what might have been a wave or a salute, or simply an acknowledgement that they had all seen what they had seen. Hermann raised his hand in return. Then the medic turned and walked back toward the American command post, and the war resumed its mechanical consumption of men. The official after-action report, filed by the 22nd Infantry Regiment for November 18, 1944, mentions the incident in a single paragraph. The report notes that 19 casualties were recovered from forward positions under enemy observation, and that medical personnel demonstrated exceptional initiative under fire. The report does not include the medic's name. Post-war attempts to identify him have produced conflicting information, as personnel records from the 4th Infantry Division's November 1944 operations are incomplete due to document losses during the Battle of the Bulge the following month. What we have instead are the testimonies of the survivors, both American and German, who witnessed what occurred that morning. Private James Sullivan from Ohio, the first man treated by the medic, would later write in a letter to his family, "I thought I was already dead. I was so cold I couldn't feel my legs anymore, and I knew I was bleeding out because I could feel it pumping out with every heartbeat. Then suddenly there was someone kneeling over me, and he took off his own jacket and put it on me, and he said, 'You're going to be okay, brother. I've got you.' And I believed him, because why would someone walk into hell to tell you a lie?" Corporal Anthony Russo from Pennsylvania, the last man evacuated, survived his chest wound and lived until 1993. In an oral history interview recorded in 1988, he described the medic as the bravest man I ever saw in my life, and I saw a lot of brave men. But what he did wasn't courage like we usually think of it. It wasn't about killing the enemy or taking territory. It was about refusing to accept that those men out there were already dead. It was about believing that every single life was worth risking his own life for, even when the mathematics said it was impossible. But perhaps the most revealing testimonies come from the German defenders. During post-war interrogations conducted as part of the U.S. Army's historical debriefing process, multiple soldiers from the 275th Infantry Division were asked about the incident. Their responses share a common theme: disbelief, initially, that evolved into something approaching reverence. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, the officer who ordered his men not to fire, told interrogators, "We had been taught that Americans were soft, that they cared more about comfort than duty, that they would break when pushed hard enough. That morning showed us we had been lied to about many things. No soft man walks into machine gun fire to save his comrades. No weak nation produces men like that medic." Feldwebel Klaus Hermann, the MG-42 gunner, who had the best position to observe the entire event, was more philosophical. In war, you stop thinking of the enemy as human. You have to, or you cannot do what war requires. But that medic made it impossible. Every wounded man he treated, we were reminded, that could be me. That could be my brother. And someone on their side cared enough to risk his life for them. We wondered if anyone on our side would do the same for us. This is the crucial transformation, the ideological shift that the medics' actions catalyzed in the minds of those German defenders. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of their cause, the righteousness of their struggle, the weakness of their adversaries. They had been told that Americans were mongrel warriors from a mongrel nation, unified by nothing deeper than material greed, lacking the iron will and spiritual strength of the German soldier. The propaganda had been relentless and comprehensive, and for many young Germans who had known no other worldview, these ideas had the weight of truth. But propaganda cannot survive contact with reality forever. And on the morning of November 18, 1944, 400 German soldiers confronted a reality that their ideology could not explain. A single American medic who valued the lives of his comrades more than his own survival, who walked into certain death because the alternative, doing nothing, was unacceptable. This was not the behavior of a weak man from a weak nation. This was something else entirely. The symbolic object at the center of this transformation was not the Red Cross brassard, though that played its role. It was not even the morphine syrettes, though those represented their own kind of material abundance that Germany could no longer match. The true symbol was the medic's empty hands. He carried no weapon. He had left his rifle behind intentionally, reducing himself to the most vulnerable possible state. And then he had walked into no man's land and performed the most dangerous possible act, caring for the wounded with every action proving he considered each life worth saving. The German military had its own medics, men who served with equal bravery under equally horrific conditions. But by November 1944, the German military medical system was collapsing under the weight of casualties it could no longer process, and supply shortages it could no longer overcome. Morphine was strictly rationed. Sulfa powder was increasingly scarce. Whole blood for transfusions was nearly impossible to obtain at forward positions. German medics did what they could with what they had, and many died trying. But the material reality was undeniable. The German war machine was running out of everything, including the means to ease suffering. The American medic, by contrast, had arrived in no man's land carrying abundance. Morphine for every wounded man, sulfa powder for every wound, bandages and plasma and organizational competence that ensured wounded soldiers moved from point of injury to field hospital with systematic efficiency. The 4th Infantry Division's medical battalion processed wounded men through established evacuation chains that could, when functioning properly, move a soldier from the front line to a hospital bed behind the lines in under 6 hours. The German 275th Infantry Division's medical system, by November 1944, was struggling to evacuate wounded within 24 hours. This was the material manifestation of a deeper truth that the German defenders recognized that morning. They were fighting for a regime that could no longer care for its own soldiers, against an enemy whose nation could afford to mass-produce mercy. The American system was not perfect, far from it, but it represented an industrial and organizational capacity that Germany had lost, if it had ever possessed it. And that capacity emerged from something the German soldiers had been taught to despise: democracy, with its messy pluralism and its insistence that individual lives mattered. The medic's solo charge into no man's land was possible because he had been trained by a medical system that valued initiative over rigid hierarchy and equipped by a logistics network that extended from pharmaceutical factories in the American Midwest to frozen forests in Germany. His willingness to risk his life emerged from a culture that emphasized individual moral choice, the same democratic culture that German propaganda had derided as weak and decadent. And his success in treating 19 wounded men emerged from training that assumed every soldier, regardless of rank or background, deserved the best possible medical care. These were revolutionary concepts in the context of 1944 Europe. The German military medical system, like German society generally, was stratified by class and ideology. Medical care reflected rank. Resources were allocated according to military value. The racial ideology of National Socialism meant that some lives were considered more valuable than others. The American system was not free from its own prejudices and inequalities. African American medics served in segregated units, and discrimination was endemic throughout the military. But the fundamental principle that every wounded soldier deserved treatment, regardless of rank, was consistently applied in the field. The German soldiers who watched the medic work for 4 hours that November morning saw this principle made flesh. They saw democracy's promise demonstrated in its most basic form. Every individual matters. Every life is worth the risk. No one is left behind. By 1,000 hours on November 18th, the tactical situation in the Hürtgen Forest had returned to its grinding stasis. Artillery exchanged fire. Patrols probed for weaknesses. Men died in numbers that would horrify those who had not become numb to horror. The medic, whose hands had saved 19 men that morning, returned to his aid station and continued treating wounded soldiers as they arrived in an endless stream. Within a week, he would be evacuated himself, suffering from severe trench foot and exposure. His subsequent fate is unknown. He may have returned to combat. He may have been sent home. The historical record is silent, but the German defenders of Grid Square 7345 never forgot what they had witnessed. In the decades after the war, as they returned to civilian life and tried to make sense of what they had done and seen, many would cite that November morning as the moment they understood they had been fighting for the wrong side. Not because they had lost. By November 1944, most German soldiers knew the war was lost, but because they had finally seen what the other side represented. It was not weakness. It was not decadence. It was a different kind of strength, one that valued human life over ideological purity and individual choice over collective obedience. Hermann, the machine gunner, emigrated to the United States in 1951. In a letter to his family, still in Germany, he wrote, "I came here because I remembered that medic. I wanted to live in a country that produced men like that. I wanted my children to grow up in a place where saving lives was considered more important than taking them." Weber, the officer who ordered his men not to fire, became a teacher in post-war West Germany. He spent 30 years educating students about the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of individual moral courage. When asked once by a student what had shaped his teaching philosophy, he described the medic in the Hürtgen Forest and said, "That man taught me that the truest form of patriotism is caring for your fellow citizens, not destroying your enemies. That is the lesson I want you to carry forward. The Hürtgen Forest today is quiet. The trees have grown back. The shell craters have filled with soil and leaves. Tourist paths wind through the woods, marked with interpretive signs explaining the battle's significance. On clear mornings, when the sun filters through the canopy and the temperature drops below freezing, you can almost imagine you hear the echoes of what occurred there 80 years ago. The crack of rifles, the scream of artillery, the cries of wounded men. And if you stand in what was once Grid Square 7345, now just another indistinguishable stretch of forest floor, you might consider what happened there on November 18, 1944. How one man, armed with nothing but a canvas bag and the conviction that every life was worth saving, walked into certain death and emerged having transformed the understanding of 400 enemy soldiers. How he demonstrated that true strength lies not in the capacity for violence, but in the willingness to care for others even when caring means risking everything. The medic never received the Medal of Honor. There is no monument bearing his name. The official records classify his actions as medical personnel demonstrating exceptional initiative under fire, a bureaucratic phrase that captures nothing of what actually occurred. history has largely forgotten him, as history forgets most individual soldiers whose heroism did not result in captured territory or killed enemies. But the 19 men whose lives he saved went home. They married. They had children. They built lives that extended forward in time like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into water. Sullivan from Ohio became a teacher. Russo from Pennsylvania worked for 30 years as a steel worker. 16 others whose names appear in casualty reports and mournings. Rosters lived decades. They would not have lived without that medic's intervention. And 400 German soldiers went home carrying a memory that contradicted everything they had been taught about America and Americans. A memory that insisted, against all their conditioning, the enemy is human. The enemy cares for their wounded with the same desperation we feel for ours. The enemy believes that individual lives matter more than tactical advantage. The enemy operates from principles that we were told represented weakness, but which that morning in November demonstrated a strength we could not match. This is what the medic's solo charge accomplished. Not captured ground, not killed enemies, but a more fundamental victory, the demonstration that the values Americans claim to fight for, individual dignity, human worth, the sanctity of life, were not merely propaganda, but principles that men would die to uphold. In a war increasingly defined by ideological opposition between democracy and fascism, between individual rights and collective obedience, between humanistic values and racial hierarchy, the medic provided the most powerful possible argument for his side. He lived his nation's ideals even when living them should have meant dying. The morphine syrettes he carried that morning, those small tubes of mass-produced mercy, represented more than medical treatment. They represented a nation wealthy enough to care for its soldiers, organized enough to deliver supplies to frozen forests, and committed enough to the principle of human worth that every wounded man received pain relief regardless of whether his injuries were survivable. Germany in November 1944 could no longer make such claims. The disparity in material abundance was obvious to every soldier who compared rations, equipment, medical supplies. But beneath that material disparity lay a more fundamental difference. One nation still believed its soldiers' individual lives mattered. The other had become a death machine that consumed its own children in pursuit of a defeated dream. The German defenders who watched the medic work that morning confronted this disparity in its most visceral form. They were defending territory their nation could no longer hold, for a regime that considered them expendable, with equipment they could barely maintain and medical support that was dissolving under the weight of unsustainable casualties. And across that no-man's land, they saw an enemy who valued his comrades' lives enough to walk into machine gun fire, carrying nothing but medical supplies and faith in a symbol that theoretically protected him. The Red Cross brassard on the medic's arm was that symbol, and it held power only if both sides agreed it had power. The German defenders, by choosing not to fire, affirmed that even in the Hürtgen Forest in November 1944, even after months of savage killing, that symbol still meant something. They chose to honor a convention that protected medical personnel. They chose to value human life over tactical advantage. They chose, for 4 hours and 38 minutes, to stop being soldiers and become witnesses to something larger than the war that had consumed them. What they witnessed was this. In the midst of industrialized slaughter, one man's insistence that mercy was stronger than violence, that caring for the wounded was more important than killing the enemy, that individual lives possessed worth beyond their tactical value. These were the principles that animated democratic societies, and the medic embodied them so completely that 400 enemy soldiers could not bring themselves to destroy him. This is the deeper story of what occurred in Grid Square 7345 on November 18, 1944. Not merely a tale of individual heroism, though the medic's courage was extraordinary by any measure, but a story about competing visions of human worth, played out on frozen ground between armies whose clash represented the fundamental ideological conflicts of the 20th century. Democracy versus authoritarianism. Individual dignity versus collective subordination. The belief that every life matters versus the conviction that some lives matter more than others. The medic won that argument without firing a shot. He won it by walking into no man's land. He won it by treating 19 wounded men as if each one was worth risking his life for. He won it by demonstrating that the values his nation claimed to defend were real enough to die for, and in refusing to die, he proved they were strong enough to survive even the worst that war could inflict. The sun has risen and set over the Hürtgen Forest more than 29,000 times since that November morning. The men who fought there are mostly gone now, passed into memory, and then into history. The forest itself has healed, though occasionally hunters or hikers still find fragments of metal half buried in the soil, rusted shrapnel that was once part of someone's death. But the medic's lesson endures, that in the darkest moments of human conflict, when violence seems like the only language anyone speaks, mercy remains possible. That caring for the wounded requires a courage as great as any warrior's. That the truest measure of a nation's strength lies not in its capacity to destroy, but in its willingness to save. And that sometimes one man with empty hands and a full heart can accomplish what entire armies cannot. He can make the enemy see his humanity, and in seeing it, remember their own. This is why 400 German soldiers, men trained to kill without hesitation, chose not to pull their triggers. This is why 19 American soldiers survived to go home. This is why the medic's solo charge into no man's land stunned everyone who witnessed it. Not because it was tactically brilliant, it was tactically insane. Not because it was inevitable, it defied every rational calculation, but because it was necessary, in a way that transcended military necessity. It was necessary because without such acts, war consumes not just lives, but the possibility of meaning itself. The medic gave meaning to that November morning. He transformed a killing ground into a place where life was affirmed. He turned enemy soldiers into witnesses of mercy. He demonstrated that even in the Hürtgen Forest, even in November 1944, even when every rational voice insisted that mercy was impossible, one man could choose to care more about saving lives than preserving his own. That choice, to value others' lives above your own survival, is the foundation of every decent civilization humans have managed to build. It is the principle that makes democracy possible, that makes community achievable, that makes life worth living. The medic carried that principle into no man's land in a canvas bag marked with a red cross, and he proved it was stronger than fear, more powerful than violence, more durable than war itself. And so the forest remembers, even if history has forgotten. The ground where he walked still exists. The trees that watched have seeded new generations, and somewhere in the silence between the wind and the pines, you can almost hear the echo of what those German defenders whispered to each other as they watched the medic work. Mein Gott! Look at what he is doing. Look at what kind of man this is. They were looking at the best of what democracy produces. Individuals who believe every life has worth, who act on that belief even when action means risking everything, and who trust that such acts, however small they may seem against the enormity of war, matter enough to make all the difference. The medic was right. They do.